Hi, everyone in Facebook land. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. Welcome to this week's Making the Grade. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach, and we're going to do a major focus on higher education, especially considering college campuses and universities are back in session somewhat, or in this ever-changing pandemic world that we now live in. Joining me to talk about a bit of his new beat is Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Kevin, before we get started, I do want to make sure people realize that we are watching and seeing their comments that come in. And obviously, our focus here on Making the Grade has always been K through higher education, kindergarten through higher education. So if you have kids in K-12 that you would like to let us know what's happening in their classrooms, how it's going at home with learning, if you have questions about what's happening in certain school districts, we definitely will take those. But you have been doing so much writing on higher education and the impact of coronavirus on campuses. I mean, we're talking everything from the number of cases of coronavirus to enrollment numbers to funding and what the college campus situation looks like in general. So tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do to make sure we're all informed about what's happening on Idaho's college campuses.
Well, we at Idaho Ed News are trying to emphasize not just K-12, but higher education and the connection between the two. So higher ed is going to become my area of emphasis as a reporter. Still going to cover K-12. I'm still going to cover the legislature, but the responsibility for covering higher education is something I'm going to take on, and I'm excited about it. I mean, there are some big challenges facing higher education in this state, financial, societal, cultural, and the public health challenges that you alluded to. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to cover with regard to higher ed. So, let's kind of jump into it a little bit today and talk about some of it.
Well, let's start then with what you're going to be doing for Idaho Education News, which I find this fascinating. And it's kind of, we're calling it the campus coronavirus cases. And you're literally going to be tracking what's happening on different college campuses when it comes to the pandemic, because even though, as you said, higher ed has been a focus of Idaho Education News and here at Making the Grade, it took a whole different turn when the pandemic happened.
It really has. So what we're going to do each Monday is write up a roundup of the coronavirus case numbers as the universities and colleges are reporting them. And to their credit, the private and public colleges alike, the 2- and 4-year schools alike, are doing a pretty good job of posting updated numbers in terms of their coronavirus cases, potential coronavirus exposures. So we're going to round that up every Monday, but we're also going to update the story and update the developments as I did this morning, because the University of Idaho came out with another round of numbers, and they're troubling.
What did you find out?
Well, they're reporting another doubling of cases on the campus. So it's about 57 new cases in the past week. What they're saying is that the outbreaks appear to be tied to fraternities and sororities. The University of Idaho Argonaut, the campus paper, is reporting that 8 Greek houses are in quarantine. So right now, the U of I is saying that the case numbers and the outbreaks do not appear to be tied to classroom learning. However, they've told instructors and they've told professors that if you want to take your face-to-face class and move it into online learning for this week, go ahead, feel free. So U of I is trying to get on top of their situation, and their situation has gotten worse in the past couple of weeks, going from maybe about a dozen cases to, like I said, about 57 cases this past week. Really 2 hotspots in the college and university system, and they're clear across the state from each other. U of I has been a hotspot. BYU Idaho in Rexburg, a private university, they're reporting a fairly significant spike in cases. And university officials are sending out the warning to the campus community that if students and staff don't take the rules seriously, namely rules restricting large gatherings, rules requiring wearing masks, they're concerned that they may have to close, that they may have to move to online learning for at least some period of time to get this, this outbreak in check. Madison County is a big hotspot in coronavirus spread. statewide, not just on the BYU Idaho campus. They have really seen a spike in cases in that part of the state. So that's an area geographically and a campus that we're going to be watching very closely in the days ahead.
One of the areas you and I have talked about many times over the last couple of months is higher education and enrollment, because the numbers, of course, tie to funding. It also ties back to the fact that Idaho has been desperately trying to get its own high school students to move on to college. And what does that look like? What does that mean in the midst of a pandemic? And you all have written a couple of stories about enrollment. And at first, when we were talking about it, Kevin, back in when the first national projections were coming out back in May even, and there was some talk of college campuses across the country seeing enrollment possibly down by 20%, at least at this point, not only here in Idaho, but across the nation, it's looking better than that.
It is looking better. So the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a nonprofit that gathers data from colleges and universities, put out a preliminary report last week looking at enrollment trends nationally. Now, this is a snapshot, and it's a very, it's a limited snapshot. It's about a fifth of the colleges and universities that normally report to the clearinghouse. What they're seeing right now is they're seeing a drop off of about 1.8%. But it's kind of interesting because the drop off in undergraduate enrollment is offset to a large degree by an increase in graduate school enrollment. And some of the demographics are really kind of interesting. Community colleges seem to be seeing a sharper drop off in enrollment than the four-year institutions. And, you're seeing, a lot of the same trends that we're seeing with undergraduate enrollment and graduate enrollment, cutting across all, demographic groups, Latino students, American Indian students, Black students, white students. So this is, it's a trend that we'll see how it holds, and we'll see what the Idaho numbers turn out to be. As it turned out, none of the Idaho institutions reported for purposes of this preliminary set of numbers. So we'll see what happens with the Idaho enrollment figures. And I'm really going to want to see the demographics because, as you said, Idaho is focused so much on getting high school graduates to continue their education in some form. If what we're seeing is really an enrollment trend that is skewing towards maybe more students coming in from out of state to attend face-to-face classes at Boise State or the other institutions, that suggests that maybe Idaho students are putting off their college education in the middle of this pandemic. So we're really going to want to dig into those numbers. We're a few weeks out from when we're going to have the Idaho figures. So, we'll watch it. I mean, we're not seeing that big decline in higher education enrollment yet, or this year, the big drop off in enrollment that a lot of experts were fearing. So, we'll continue to watch it closely.
If you're just joining us, I'm Michelle Edmonds here with Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News talking Making the Grade. We're taking a deep dive into higher education right now, but as we've mentioned, if you have thoughts or concerns or questions about what's happening in K-12, or just want to talk to us about what's happening in your own school district, we'd love to hear that in your comments and questions. When we talk about enrollment numbers for higher education, Kevin, it ties directly to funding.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
maybe you can give people a perspective of, why is it so important, obviously, that kids show up for classes in order to fund? But you think about Boise State, and I think the highlight of the conversation on Idaho Ed News was, furloughs and football, which, the two kind of go hand in hand. We could talk a little bit about the football season and kind of what's happened with that, but it all ties back to furloughs, football funding, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the funding situation for Boise State is very uncertain. I took a look last week at how coronavirus aid is helping the colleges and universities get through this crisis and kind of the limitations of it. So let's dig into some numbers here. When you add it all up, the public universities and colleges received about $49 million from the feds. And this was part of this, huge coronavirus stimulus law that was passed back in March, right at the outset of the outbreak. That $49 million, that includes about $18 million that went straight into student aid. It was direct aid for students who had incurred financial losses of one kind or another because of the pandemic, whether it was losing a work-study job that dried up and losing the income off of that, increased costs for childcare, you name it, any kind of expense that could be incurred. And think about it. When students were sent home in March and April, they incurred expense. The rest of that money went into the universities, and it was designed to offset losses related to the pandemic, expenses related to the pandemic. So we've seen a lot of that money going into upgrading classrooms, upgrading facilities so that colleges and universities can move classes online. You've seen a lot of it go into PPE, whether that's plexiglass shields to to set up a barrier between the instructors and the students, thermal stations so you can check temperatures as people enter into buildings, you name it. So the money has helped in those areas, but it really hasn't helped and wasn't designed to help the colleges and universities deal with some long-standing financial issues. U of I has had shortfalls. Idaho State University has had shortfalls. Lewis Clark State College has faced shortfalls. Now Boise State is facing a really tight budget situation as a result of expenses and lost revenues because of the pandemic. And the federal money does not cover all of that and will not cover all of that. So when we talk about furloughs at Boise State University and we talk about job losses at Boise State University, that seems to be pretty much inevitable. And part of the revenue picture, academic purists hate to hear this, but this is the truth. A lot of what happens in terms of the revenue picture does tie back into athletics. And Boise State has talked about losing an entire football season is a loss of $25 to $30 million. Now, we know they're not going to lose an entire football season. It's going to be a shortened season. We don't know what that means in terms of fans in the stands. We don't know what that means in terms of television revenue or bowl revenue. But we know that it'll be somewhere less than $25 to $30 million of loss, but it's not going to be completely all the way covered. So, a lot of uncertainty facing the budget picture at Boise State, and we're going to be watching that very closely.
And it'll be fascinating to see as the year comes along, and obviously what happens with the pandemic, where that takes Boise State in the years to come, and how much of this shortfall continues to be the case in the next year or the year after that. Like, what cuts are made? Because as you and I, when we talked even with Dr. Marlene Tromp, when she came on and did a panel discussion with us, and I think she reiterated it again recently, but saying basically, she's not a kind of slash and burn kind of person, that all of this is going to be done, especially on the Boise State campus, really carefully. That it's not just, okay, we have to take 10% off the budget, whoop, there's 10%. It's done much more systematically than that.
She wants to be strategic, and you have to remember that a big part of her strategy is to try to make connections with students in Idaho and get more Idaho students, especially rural students, to continue their education at Boise State. So I'm going to be really interested in the coming weeks when we get those enrollment figures from Boise State. Boise State is projecting that their enrollment might actually increase a little bit this year, but where are those students coming from? Boise State is projecting an increase in out-of-state enrollment. Students from California or other states where face-to-face learning is not available, looking at Boise State and saying, okay, well, we'll go out of state, we'll pay the out-of-state tuition, and we'll go to Boise, we'll go to Idaho to get into a face-to-face setting. So Boise State is expecting an increase in out-of-state enrollment, but a decline in enrollment from in-state. Now that's got some financial implications because out-of-state students pay more to attend a state university, but it also it gets to the issue of getting more Idaho students into the university system, into the college system, which has been a high priority for state officials. And it's something that President Marlene Tromp takes very seriously. She talks about it pretty much at every opportunity, talking about as a first-generation graduate herself, as somebody who came from a rural community in Wyoming, really recognizing that the state needs to do more and do better at getting rural students and first-generation students to see the value of a college education and see the connection between getting a college education and maybe even going back to their home communities and making a difference in their hometowns. So that's all a big deal to Marlene Tromp, and it's a big deal to a lot of folks in state political and education circles. So it's not just going to be the raw numbers, how many students are in the door, but I'm really going to want to see where they came from, what the demographics look like, what are the trends, and how does that affect higher education going forward?
One of the interesting things that happened in the past week, Kevin, I want to pick your brain about a little bit, is something else that happened with the State Board of Education, which, in case people need a refresher, the State Board of Education here in Idaho handles all matters kindergarten through higher education, which is not necessarily the case in a lot of states where they break apart their K-12 system from their state college system. But that doesn't happen here. It's all together. And we're talking one step further than higher education. The State Board of Education took up funding medical residencies and what they're trying to do in order to talk about bringing higher education students into the state of Idaho and being able to keep them here. Can you give us a little update on what the board is seeing here as so important in medical residencies and how much money could go to this?
Yeah, short State Board of Education meeting on Monday, but a significant one nonetheless. The State Board signed on to a plan that Governor Little endorses as well to put $900,000 into graduate medical programs. $900,000 is enough to fund 15 medical residencies. And the idea is, as you say, is to attract more young doctors into the state in hopes that they stay. This is one area where Governor Little deviated from his plan to cut across the board on the budget and to hold to a hold the line budget. This is one area where he's saying, yeah, we need to put a little bit more money. State board signed on very quickly, very little discussion or debate. This still has to go to the legislature. This funding doesn't go into effect until next year. So what happened on Monday is that the governor and the state board came together in agreement on requesting $900,000 to boost medical residencies. Now it'll be up to the legislature to decide whether to do that.
Kevin, why do they see this as so important?
Well, I think, in the middle of a pandemic, you've got to realize that, any kind of doctor shortage is a serious thing. And, the state has been dealing with doctor shortages for some time. So anything that you can do to, maybe get more young physicians, young resident physicians in the door to at least, spend some time in Idaho, do their residency in Idaho and perhaps stay in Idaho. Clearly at any time, that's a challenge for a state like Idaho. But in the middle of a public health crisis like this, I think it's even more of a challenge.
And maybe people didn't realize this. Why does the State Board of Education have to be tied into this? Why does that work that way?
The state board has a lot of responsibilities, and it does go back to higher education and it does go back to medical education. So to the extent that we have medical education in Idaho, which is pretty limited, the state board oversees that as well. I mean, the state board has a lot on its plate, as we've talked about before. I mean, they cover everything from K-12 to higher education. Public television is under their umbrella. There's a lot the state board is dealing with at any given time.
So tell us, as we begin to wrap up here, what are you going to be doing at Idaho Education News, tweaking your job responsibilities a little bit? What can people be looking for from you when it comes to higher education reporting? What do you really want to dig into? And you alluded to it a little bit at the beginning, because not only will you be putting out information on your blog, but where do you want to take the deep dive?
I want to look at four areas that I think are the four big challenges facing higher education in the state. The first, obviously, is the public health challenge. How do you deliver education in the middle of a global health crisis? Second thing I want to look at is how do you get more students into the system? This enrollment challenge that is a challenge, especially during the pandemic, but it's already been a challenge for colleges and universities in the state. Enrolling more students and enrolling more first-generation students, more students of color, more students from rural Idaho. So that's the second thing. The third challenge I want to look at is the funding, the fiscal realities that are facing higher education. And the fourth is kind of the political and cultural challenge facing higher education. We saw this even before the pandemic. Legislators questioning how the higher education system is spending its money, questioning what they consider to be the political bent of higher education in the state. So there's the political consideration, and there's also the family consideration, where parents and students not really, they're questioning the value of going to college. They're questioning the value of getting a college degree. So I want to look at the political and the cultural challenges facing higher education as well. So those are four big challenges. And if a story about higher education doesn't at least check off one of those boxes, it might not be something we cover as closely. But that's my checklist.
That's a pretty big checklist. I'll just say that to you as a friend and as a journalist.
But they all kind of intersect. I mean, they you would draw a Venn diagram and there would be a lot of intersection between these four big topics. So there's plenty for us to get to.
I agree. And I'm excited to hear and see what you produce in terms of content and be able to talk with you about it here on Making the Grade. We did just get a few comments. I just want to bring in a few people. Said Eduardo saying, I just started school yesterday and I can tell you it is good so far. He goes on to say that masks are worn inside but can be taken off outside. So Eduardo, I don't know where you're coming from, but congratulations upon being back in school. And then Cody's joining us again saying, my 9-year-old has been in school for a month and has no problem with a mask on. He's just happy to be in school. Mm-hmm. And an anecdote from my own life, I have to tell you that masks aren't fun for the kids. I get it. They get it. But my kids have also told me, and I'm coming from a place of my children being teenagers now, but that they're not undoable, that they're making it work and that the teachers are making it work. So we get that everybody's having to do what they need to do, but some nice comments coming in there.
They're not fun for anybody. I don't think anybody, I can tell you, I wear a mask everywhere when I'm outside. When I'm outside my home or when I'm outside my office, not because I enjoy it, but because it's the right thing to do at this point. It's the best thing we can do as individuals to do our part to keep this thing from spreading any more than it already is.
So then my big question to you as we end our segment today on Making the Grade is, normally we talk about socks because it's fun and, maybe whether or not your mask matches your socks, but specifically now you've got a different look going for us because not only are you masking up, you're hatting up. Yes. I realize that's not a word. Okay. But no. It's something very near and dear to your heart. And when we talk athletics, are you going to show something new today, Kevin?
Yes, we are. And it's a lot easier to do a hat segment than a sock segment. It's a lot less, less stretching and moving around. So, Michelle, you and I, we don't see eye to eye on this one.
We don't.
You're a San Francisco Giants fan. I am a longtime Oakland Athletics fan. And today is a work day. It's also the start of the playoffs. The A's take the field in about 2.5 hours. So I'm going to be juggling work, and I am going to be working this afternoon. I do have some interviews to do, but I'll have the game on in the background with the sound down. It's another playoff appearance for Oakland. They've struggled in the postseason the past couple of years, so hoping for a little bit of a run this time around.
I would say go, but I can't. I
know it's hard for you. I get it.
Yeah, no.
But I will say this about. Okay. I mean, I know you're a San Francisco Giant fan, so this is hard for you. A few years back, my son and I, who's also an Oakland fan, we went to a game, Oakland and San Francisco, at it was the game in San Francisco, and for as much of a rivalry as this is, and I get it, it's the two Bay Area teams, it's San Francisco, it's Oakland, it's all sorts of dynamics. It was probably about the friendliest rivalry I've ever seen. I mean, people were, they were ribbing each other, but they weren't throwing beer at each other. They weren't cursing at each other. It was very it was very friendly. There was friendly trash talk, which is a lot of fun. And
you noticed
the A's lost that day, but that's fine.
Well, yeah, that's better. But you noticed what I'm kind of wearing, because when you
orange, I know.
Your hat, I changed my outfit to make sure you realized where my allegiance stood.
Yeah, well, it's always next season for San Francisco, and hopefully this season will end well for my team, but we'll see.
Well, have fun today, working and working from the office, but also having a chance to watch your team. I love it. Kevin Richert, Idaho Education News, reporter extraordinaire, Making the Grade, co-host. So appreciate you taking the time, as you've been doing every week, to join us. And we're going to continue to watch Idaho Ed News and the whole team over there do some of the best work that I've seen in years. So thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go Giants.
Well, if you insist. I don't know where they go.